Welcome to this training video about CPU load in T1. The intent of this video is to provide you with an overview of the different types of CPU load that T1 can measure for you. Please let me start with the definition of CPU load as it is used by T1 for classic AUTOSAR systems. The CPU load is calculated from the time TE, which is the time the CPU spends processing code other than idle code in relation to the duration of the observation period T0. This will return a number between 0 and 1, which is usually expressed in percentage. Where 0% means that the CPU is spending all its time processing idle code and 100% means that it spends all its time processing foreground code. Please keep in mind that it is important to know and specify the observation period when talking about CPU load. Let us now switch to T1. The first thing we see in T1, after we connect to the ECU, is the T1 cont table view. On top of it, we see CPU load values for each CPU core. This is the so-called BSF CPU load. BSF stands for Basic Scheduling Frame. It represents the observation period T0. We will soon see what this observation period is in this project. But let me first expand the entry for CPU core 0. We can now see that the CPU load value on the left represents the minimum of the observed CPU load. The one on the right the maximum of the observed CPU load. And the one in the middle is a momentary value. Please note that all these measurement values and in fact all measurement values in the T1 cont table view are calculated on the ECU and just displayed here. Let us now switch to a T1 scope scheduling trace, which I downloaded before for CPU core 0 only to keep things simple. In the download trace we can see a green and a red bar on top of it. The green bar represents the BSF with the lowest CPU load in this trace and the red bar the BSF with the high CPU load value. Here 12.9 and 15.2%. Let's investigate how long these bars are, or in other words, what is the observation period for which T1 calculated the BSF CPU load in this example project. We can do this by selecting the time range for one of these bars. As we can see, the observation period for the BSF CPU load is about 25 milliseconds in this project. Please note that this time range seems to correlate with the activation of the Core 0 25 milliseconds task. We can also go to the Project Explorer to review the configuration for the BSF for CPU Core 0 in this project. As we can see, it is set to the activation event of the Core 0 25 milliseconds task, which fits what we have observed in the trace. While we are here, let me introduce you to the Selection Information view. This view provides you with details for the currently selected time range in a trace. Let me again select the time range for the red bar. We can see that the Selection Information view has calculated the overall CPU load for this selection, and it also shows the CPU load values for the individual interrupt service routines and tasks. The overall CPU load of 15.2% matches the BSF CPU load for the time frame we have selected. Which makes sense as these time frames are about the same. Earlier in this video I have said that it is important to know and specify the observation period when talking about CPU load. We can use the Selection Information view to demonstrate this. Let me now select the time range of both of these bars. I have now selected a time range of approximately 50 milliseconds. The selection CPU load for this time range is 14.1%, which is the average of the two BSF CPU load values, 12.9 and 15.2%. This means selecting a longer observation period has provided us with a more average value than before. What will happen if we select a shorter time range as our observation period? To demonstrate this, let me first zoom onto the time range of the red bar. When we now select the first half of the red bar, about 12.5 milliseconds, we can see that the selection CPU load, for this time range, is now 19.1%. When we select the second half, we can see that the selection CPU load is now 11.3%. When we do the math and calculate the average of 19.1% and 11.3%, we will see that this is again 15.2%, which was our starting value. Selecting shorter time ranges as our observation period will provide us with more extreme values for the CPU load. In other words, the minimum value will be lower and the maximum value will be higher than it was before. This is an important lesson when it comes to selecting the time ranges for calculating CPU load. Another type of CPU load, in T1, is the focus CPU load, which can only be measured by T1 cont. To demonstrate this, let me switch back to the T1 cont table view. We can use the sprocket symbol to the right of an ISR or task entry to start a focus measurement. After a short time, T1 will display the focus CPU load. Please note that there is only one value. This is the average CPU load of this task for the time frame that the focus measurement is running. We can open the focus measurement view to see more details. Here we can see that the duration for this measurement is currently about 30 seconds, and the T1 cont has taken about 32,000 instances of this task into account for calculating the focus CPU load. In summary, in this video we have seen three different types of CPU load. The BSF CPU load, which can be calculated by T1 cont and T1 scope. The selection CPU load, which can be calculated by T1 scope only. The focus CPU load, which can be calculated by T1 cont only. The main difference between these were the different observation periods that were used to calculate the CPU load. Please keep in mind that the observation period for calculating CPU load is important, as it will greatly influence the calculated CPU load value.